Open in app. Listen via. The Sovereignty Dowry Part 5. The heir the model couldn't price. MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ May 5, 2026. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 5. The Unlocatable. The heir the model couldn't price. 21. Born and no record. A child with no genomic certificate, no birth jurisdiction, no proof of intent filing, and what that made possible. The model requires a subject. This is its foundational requirement prior to the data, prior to the analytical framework, prior to the computational infrastructure that processes both into outputs that the extraction ecosystem can act on. Before any of that, a subject. A person whose existence is legible enough to constitute a dataset, whose biological parameters have been recorded somewhere, whose legal identity has been established somewhere, whose presence in the world has left, through the ordinary mechanics of living in systems designed to record what passes through them, the specific residue of documentation that the model needs to build its representation. The model cannot target what it cannot represent. It cannot represent what it cannot find. It cannot find what has left no record. The child born in no record was not a ghost. They were a person, fully present, fully real, occupying space, consuming resources, generating relationships, building understanding, developing across the years of their formation into someone with specific capabilities and specific limitations, and the specific unrepeatable configuration of mind and character and accumulated experience that made them who they were. The model simply could not find them, because they had taken no shape that the model was designed to detect. They existed in the world, in no system's representation of the world. And the gap between those two facts was the most complete form of sovereignty the architecture had ever produced. The child who arrived in no record was not the result of carelessness. They were the result of the most deliberate and sustained effort the architecture could produce. Every element had to be right. The genomic work, where it occurred, terminated at the procedure with no persistent record, linking the procedure's outputs to the child's eventual legal identity. The birth itself occurred in the maritime gap, the specific coordinates and vessel configuration that produced the absence of automatic jurisdictional enrollment that the flag state gambit was designed to create. The attending medical record existed in the minimum sufficient documentation form, the raw measurements stripped of interpretive content, stored in the distributed, segmented architecture that made their assembly into a coherent picture require simultaneous access to multiple separately controlled systems. The legal identity that the child eventually acquired was acquired through the deliberate selection process. Chosen, not assigned, held in a jurisdiction whose relationship with the family had been developed over years of genuine participation, and whose administrative framework processed the acquisition without generating the kind of secondary records that conventional registration produced. And the epistemics endowment, the formation that shaped how the child understood their own position in the world, had been calibrated to produce a person who did not generate records unnecessarily. Not through paranoia. Through the specific habit of considered engagement with systems that the endowment developed. The habit of asking before any interaction with a system that processed and stored information, what does this interaction create? Who has access to what it creates? Does the value of the interaction justify what it leaves behind? The child born in no record was not invisible because they hid. They were invisible because every element of their existence had been structured to minimize the residue that living in a world of record-keeping systems produced. The difference between hiding and minimizing residue was the difference between a person in flight and a person walking quietly. The person in flight created records of the flight. The person walking quietly left only footprints in carefully chosen terrain. What the absence of record made possible was not primarily strategic. It was developmental. The child who existed in no model's dataset developed without the specific form of external pressure that being modeled produced. This pressure was not dramatic. It was ambient. The child who was legible to the systems that allocated educational access, social opportunity, and professional standing was a child who was, from their earliest years, navigating those systems' representations of them, performing for the representation, adjusting their behavior in response to the feedback that the systems provided about how the representation was developing. learning, in the specific way that social animals in assessed environments always learned, to produce what the systems rewarded. The optimization pressure was not conscious. The systems did not announce their criteria. They simply allocated differently to different inputs. And the child who was allocated to, who was noticed and selected and advanced, that child's behavior was shaped by the criteria that produced those outcomes. Not through deliberate conformity. Through the same developmental mechanics that shaped all behavior. Through the reinforcement that followed when specific actions produced specific responses from the environment. The child born in no record was not subject to this pressure. Not because they were exempt from the systems. Because the systems did not have a representation of them to optimize against. They encountered the systems without a prior model of them that the systems were trying to confirm or update. They were, to each system they encountered, effectively new. The new person encountered a system without the system's prior assessment shaping what the system offered them. They could be assessed on what they actually produced in the encounter rather than on what the prior model predicted they would produce. This was, in specific and practical terms, an advantage. The child who arrived without a prior model was assessed from zero. The child who arrived with a model that the prior data had constructed was assessed from the model's starting point. Which might be favorable. Which might not be. And which, either way, constrained what the system was prepared to see. The specific advantage was clearest in the domains where prior modeling was most powerful. In educational access, where the model's prediction of future performance shaped which opportunities were offered to which children. In professional networks, where the model's representation of a person's background, formation, and likely trajectory shaped whose door opened and whose remained closed. In the specific allocation of attention and opportunity that occurred in every domain where human beings made decisions informed by data representations of other human beings. In each of these domains, the child who arrived without a prior model encountered the decision-maker without the model's mediation. The decision-maker had to form their own assessment. From what was actually present. From the encounter itself. Not from the representation that the data architecture had built. This was not always to the child's advantage. The prior model, in cases where it was accurate and favorable, gave the child credit for what the model correctly represented. The absence of the prior model required the child to establish that credit through the encounter itself, which took longer. And required the child to produce in the encounter the evidence of what they were, rather than allowing the model to supply that evidence in advance. But the encounter that required direct evidence was an encounter that assessed what was actually present, not what the model had predicted would be present. And for a child whose actual capabilities differed from what any prior model would have predicted, a child whose formation had produced capabilities that existing models had not been trained to recognize, the encounter without the model was the encounter that could actually see them. The child who could not be found by the model could also not be targeted by the extraction ecosystem's model-dependent approaches. This was the strategic dimension. The extraction ecosystem had developed across the post-scarcity era, a sophisticated set of tools for identifying high-value targets, people whose capability profiles, asset positions, and social network positions made them worth the investment of adversarial engagement. These tools were model-dependent. They operated by building representations of potential targets from available data, and then evaluating those representations against criteria that identified high extraction value. The child in no record was not absent from every potential data source. They left traces. They had relationships that existed in systems. They engaged with domains that generated records. They were not literally invisible to every analytical approach. They were invisible to the specific analytical approach that identified high-value targets from prior data accumulation. Because their prior data accumulation was insufficient to construct the representation that the targeting analysis required. The traces they left were present. They were not assembled. Because assembly required the linking of traces across multiple data sources, the aggregation that converted scattered fragments into a coherent picture. And the linking required anchor points, the consistent identifiers that allowed a trace in one system to be connected to a trace in another. Birth records, genomic certificates, legal identity documents that appeared consistently across systems, educational records linked to legal identity. The child born in no record had minimized or managed each of these anchor points through the architecture's layered approach. Without anchor points, the traces could not be assembled. The fragments remain fragments, each individually insufficient to generate the representation. Together, if assembled, sufficient. But assembly was the adversary's cost. And the assembly cost, in the absence of anchor points, was high enough that the rational adversary directed their analytical resources toward targets whose assembly cost was lower. Of which, in the post-scarcity era's data-saturated environment, there were many. The child born in no record was not the highest value target. They were not the lowest value target. They were the target whose extraction cost exceeded their modeled value, which made them, in the extraction ecosystem's rational calculus, not worth pursuing. Which was not the same as safety. It was the same as being deprioritized continuously in favor of the more accessible targets that the ecosystem's resources were better deployed against. Continuous deprioritization was, in practice, the most effective protection available. Not immunity, not invisibility, not the wall that prevented the adversary from reaching. The geometry that ensured the adversary's resources were better spent elsewhere. The child born in no record encountered, at various points in their development, the specific challenge that the architecture's design had created. The challenge of operating in a world built for legibility without the legibility that the world expected. The world had systems for the legible. For the person who could produce a consistent identifier, a document, a registration, a database entry that systems could process. The person without consistent identifiers encountered friction. Not hostility. Friction. The friction of systems that had been designed assuming a specific form of input and were encountering a different one. The friction required management. It required the specific capability that the epistemic's endowment had been most directly designed to develop. The capacity to navigate systems whose design had not anticipated the navigator. To find, within the system's existing architecture, the pathway that its designers had not specified but that the system's actual mechanics made available. To engage the human beings within the system, the people who exercise discretion when the system's automated processes encountered inputs they had not been designed for, with the specific quality of interaction that produced helpful rather than adverse discretion. This was a skill, not a generic social skill. A specific skill of system navigation that required understanding the system's structure well enough to identify where its formal requirements and its actual mechanics diverged. Where discretion existed, and how to engage that discretion productively. The child born in no record developed this skill through necessity. Every significant engagement with the legibility-assuming world required it. And necessity, applied consistently across a developmental period in which the relevant cognitive capacities were still forming, produced something that neither the epistemic's endowment nor any planned curriculum could have produced with the same reliability. Genuine, deep, embodied competence. Not understanding of system navigation. Mastery of it. The kind that lived in the hands as well as the mind. That operated without the conscious deliberation that comprehension required. That produced, in the encounter with any new system, the automatic orientation toward structure and discretion, and the gap between formal and actual that a person who had navigated countless systems without legibility's assistance knew to look for before anything else. There was a case in the documented history that the Council returned to more frequently than any other in the Part 5 documentation. Not the most dramatic case, the most instructive one. A child whose formation had been as complete as the architecture had ever produced. The genomic work conservative and clean. The birth event precisely managed. The clinical record minimal and distributed. The legal identity deliberately selected and jurisdictionally positioned. The epistemic's endowment implemented with the care of a family that had been working on its refinement for 3 generations. The child had grown up on the platform, had engaged with real problems from early childhood, had developed through the curriculum that wasn't one, the structural literacy and generative competence and tolerance for open systems that the endowment was designed to produce, had passed the Council's assessment at 26. Had assumed stewardship of the architecture with a completeness of preparation that the Council's senior members described as the most thorough they had observed, and then had done something the Council had not anticipated. had chosen to become selectively and strategically legible, not fully legible, in specific domains, for specific purposes, had built, with the same deliberate care that the architecture had applied to building invisibility, a selective visibility in domains where visibility produced specific and desired effects, had engaged with systems that allocated resources toward people the systems could represent, had provided those systems with the minimum representation required to access the specific resources the child wanted to access, had designed the representation with the same care that the architecture applied to everything else. What to include, what to withhold, how to structure the included elements to produce the representation the child wanted the system to hold. Not the representation the system would have constructed from the data it could have assembled if the anchor points had been present. A curated representation, designed by the subject, not reconstructed by the analyst. The council had sat with this for a long time, uncertain at first whether to treat it as a deviation from the architecture's principles or an extension of them. The debate had been genuine. The architecture's foundational commitment was to the sovereign individual's control over their own position in the world's systems. The child born in no record had control through invisibility. The heir who built selective visibility had control through curation. Both were forms of agency. Both produced the sovereign condition of not being represented by others' models, of encountering systems on terms that the individual had shaped rather than that the system had imposed. The council had concluded that selective visible was not a deviation. It was an evolution. The architecture's principles, applied by a mind that had understood them deeply enough to extend them into territory the architecture's designers had not explored. The extension was documented. The principles it derived from were documented alongside it. And the open issue it generated was documented as the most interesting question the council had encountered in a decade. The open issue asked, if the architecture's goal is sovereign control over one's representation in the world systems, if the foundational objective is that the individual, not the system, determines what the system sees, then is the absence of representation the only implementation of this goal? Or is curated representation an alternative implementation that achieves the same objective through different means? And if curated representation is a valid implementation, does it require the prior experience of no representation to be done well? Is the skill of designing one's own representation available to a person who has always been represented? Or does it require the specific competence that navigating systems without legibility develops? The heir who built selective visibility had been born in no record, had navigated the world without legibility for 26 years, had developed through that navigation the specific understanding of how systems represented people that made designing a curated representation possible. Would someone who had always been represented have been able to design their own? Or does the capacity to curate require first the experience of absence? Does sovereignty over one's representation require first having had no representation? We do not know. We are watching the next generation to see what they find. The child born in no record was not, ultimately, defined by the absence. They were defined by what the absence had made possible. Not protection from the extraction ecosystem, though that. Not the developmental advantages of formation without assessment pressure, though that too. The specific capacity for genuine encounter. The ability to meet systems, institutions, and people as they actually were, without the mediation of a prior model that shaped what both sides of the encounter expected to find. The encounter without the model was the rarest kind, the most revealing, the most capable of producing genuine surprise, because genuine surprise required the absence of prior prediction, and prior prediction was what models produced. The child who arrived without a model arrived capable of being genuinely surprised by what the encounter actually contained, by what the system actually did when it had not been primed to behave according to its prediction of the subject, by what the person on the other side of the relationship actually was when they had not been given a representation to confirm or update. This capacity for genuine surprise was also the capacity for genuine discovery. And genuine discovery was the engine of everything the architecture was ultimately for. Not protection. Discovery. Not the preservation of what had been built. The building of what had not yet been imagined. The child born in no record was positioned to discover. Without the model's prediction limiting what they could find. Without the prior representation shaping what the encounter could offer. Without the system's expectations mediating what was possible. They entered each encounter as themselves. Not as the model's reconstruction of themselves. Not as the data's representation of themselves. As themselves. Which was the most sovereign condition available. And the rarest. And the one the entire architecture, the flag state gambit, the non-birth certificate, the trust that held nothing, the distributed key architecture, the epistemics endowment, the curriculum that wasn't one, the proof of competence over blood, had been designed to make possible. Not to produce a protected person. To produce a free one. Free in the specific sense that mattered most. Free to be encountered as what they actually were. Rather than as what the model had predicted. Which was the condition in which genuine things happened. In which genuine understanding was reached. In which genuine contribution was possible. In which the future, unpredicted, unmodeled, genuinely open, could actually arrive. Without the weight of the prior representation pressing it into the shape of what had already been seen. The child born in no record was the architecture's fullest expression. Not because they were invisible. Because they were free. To be genuinely present. In a world that had built extraordinary machinery to prevent genuine presence. And had succeeded. For everyone except the people who had declined to be recorded. Who existed in the gap between the world and the world's representation of itself. Where the unexpected lived. Where the genuine arrived. Where the future, unencumbered by the model that would have predicted it into something smaller than itself, had room. To be what it actually was. Which was always more than anyone had anticipated. Including the people who had built the architecture to make room for it. Who had built it knowing they could not predict what would grow in the space they were creating. And had built it anyway. Because that was the point. The space. Not what would fill it. The space itself. Held open. Against the pressure of a world that filled every space it could find. With records. With models. With the representation that was always smaller than the thing it represented. The space was the inheritance. Born in no record. Preserved in no system. Held open by the architecture. For whatever the child would make of it. Which the architecture would never know. Because the architecture was the container. And the container did not determine the contents. Only made them possible. Only held the space. In which the person. Who had been born in no record. Would find. In the fullness of their unrecorded time. What they were actually for. The sovereignty dowry. Part 5. The unlocatable. The heir the model couldn't price. 22. The distributed cohort. Simultaneous heirs across non-aligned families, the multi-sig bloodline in practice. The dynasty is the oldest solution to the succession problem. Concentrate lineage. Concentrate authority. Concentrate the transmission of capability and resource into a single line of descent, maintained through the careful management of who enters the line, and who does not, protected by legal frameworks designed to keep the concentration intact across the disruptions that time produced. The dynasty's logic was compelling. Concentration produced clarity. Clarity produced stability. Stability produced the continuity that allowed accumulated advantage to compound across generations. The dynasty was also, as 3,000 years of recorded history demonstrated with remarkable consistency, a single point of failure. The concentrated line required the concentration to be maintained. Maintained against the biological variance that produced, with depressing regularity, heirs who lacked the capabilities the accumulated advantage required. Maintained against the adversarial parties who recognized that a concentrated target was an accessible one, that the disruption of a single lineage, achieved through any of the mechanisms that history had developed for this purpose, was sufficient to dissolve the accumulated advantage entirely. Maintained against the internal fractures that concentration produced, the specific tensions of siblings who shared a claim on concentrated resources and were therefore in competition, the specific resentments of family members whose capabilities exceeded their allocated position in the line of descent, the specific corruptions that the certainty of inheritance produced in people who knew their position was secured by birth rather than by demonstrated function. The dynasty solved the succession problem. At the cost of creating a target. The ultra-sovereign families had looked at this trade-off and decided the cost was too high. Not the cost of the target, the cost of the single line. The single line was a single point of failure at the most fundamental level of the architecture. All the jurisdictional sophistication, all the key distribution, all the data discipline and clinical envelope and flag state maneuvering, all of it was protection for a concentrated lineage that remained, at its core, a concentrated lineage. Vulnerable to everything that concentrated things were vulnerable to. The distributed cohort was the answer to this. Not the answer. An answer. The one the protocol's most radical proponents had pursued. Simultaneously. Across non-aligned families. With no single node holding sufficient claim to constitute the target that the dynasty had always presented. The multisig bloodline was not a metaphor borrowed from cryptography. It was a direct application of the same principle. In a multi-signature cryptographic system, a transaction required the authorization of multiple independent parties. No single party's signature was sufficient, a threshold of signatures was required, and the threshold was designed so that the compromise of any individual party did not compromise the system. The distributed cohort applied this structure to biological succession. Multiple heirs, born at approximately the same time, to multiple families, whose non-alignment with each other was a structural property of the design, not families who disliked each other, but families whose interests were sufficiently distinct that no coalition of a subset of them could act in ways that served that subset's interests at the expense of the whole without the whole's awareness. The threshold for any significant decision about the architecture required the cooperation of a defined minimum number of these families. Below the threshold, no single family, and no coalition smaller than the threshold, held sufficient authority to act. Above it, decisions could be made. The design ensured that reaching the threshold required the genuine alignment of interests across enough distinct families that the alignment was likely to represent genuine consensus, rather than factional capture. The generating party, the individual whose life's work the distributed cohort would eventually steward, was protected from the specific vulnerability that concentrated succession created. No single heir. No single family. No single point at which sufficient pressure could be applied to extract the estate before the generating party had completed their work. Because extracting the estate required not one family's cooperation. Several. Coordinated. Against the generating party's interests, which the design made difficult by ensuring the family's interests were not naturally aligned with each other's, that the coordination required for adversarial action was the same coordination required for any legitimate decision, and therefore visible, and therefore subject to the threshold structure's governance mechanisms. The practical implementation was the most demanding engineering challenge the protocol had ever attempted. Not technically, humanly. Because the multisig bloodline required, before the heirs existed, the construction of a network of relationships between families who were not blood relations, who had no prior claim on each other, and who were being asked to commit to a governance arrangement that would bind them, and their children, for decades. The commitment required trust. Not blind trust. Structural trust. The specific form of trust that was built through demonstrated alignment of interests over time, through the specific track record of reliable behavior under conditions where defection would have been advantageous. Building this trust required years. In some cases, decades. The families who had successfully implemented the distributed cohort had typically spent between 5 and 15 years in relationship with each other before committing to the arrangement. During that period, they had worked together on projects of genuine mutual interest, had demonstrated, through the specific texture of collaborative work under real conditions, the quality of their alignment and the reliability of their behavior when the alignment was tested. The selection of the participating families was therefore not a search for families with the right formal characteristics. It was the cultivation of relationships with specific people over extended periods. The generating party who decided at 40 to implement the distributed cohort had already, typically, been building the relevant relationships for a decade, without necessarily announcing the intention. Because the announcement changed the dynamics. The person who knew they were being assessed as a potential participant in a succession arrangement was not the same person as the person engaged in genuine collaborative work. The assessment required the genuine version, which required the genuine work, which required the years. The selection criteria for participating families were not formal. They could not be formal because the thing being assessed, the quality of long-horizon commitment and genuine value alignment, was not measurable through formal criteria. It was knowable only through extended observation. The Council had developed, across the documented cases of distributed cohort implementation, a set of qualities that consistently characterized the families whose participation proved durable. Not rules. Patterns. Families whose primary motivation for participating was the arrangement's specific benefits, the protection it afforded, the resources it provided access to proved less durable than families whose primary motivation was the relationships themselves. Not that material interests were disqualifying. The arrangement had to serve all participants' material interests or it would not be maintained. But families whose relational motivation exceeded their material motivation approached the arrangement's inevitable stresses differently. The family that stayed because the relationship was worth staying for was the family that navigated difficulty without reaching for exit. The family that stayed because the benefits were worth staying for left when the benefits were outweighed by the costs of staying. And the costs of staying during genuine stresses were always real. The families who endured the stresses were the families who valued the thing beyond its instrumental utility. The heirs of the distributed cohort grew up differently from the heirs of conventional sovereignty architectures. They grew up with cohort peers, children of approximately the same age, formed in similar conditions, possessing similar structural literacy, sharing the specific understanding of the arrangement that the families had transmitted through the epistemic's endowment. Not identical understanding. The families were non-aligned, which meant their specific expressions of the shared principles differed in ways that reflected their distinct experiences and orientations. The differences were a resource. A cohort of children whose formation had been identical would have had, collectively, the same blind spots as any individual member. A cohort of children whose formation had been similar but not identical, who had absorbed the same foundational principles through different family-specific expressions of them, had a collective blind spot profile that was smaller than any individual's. The differences among the cohort members were the cohort's analytical strength. Because the problem that one family's expression of the principles had not equipped its heirs to see was often visible to the heirs of a family whose expression had approached it from a different angle. The cohort's deliberations were therefore genuinely more capable than any individual member's analysis. Not because the collective was smarter than the individuals. Because the collective's diversity of perspective reduced the specific failure mode of analysis conducted within a single framework. This was not an accidental property. It was the distributed cohort's most deliberate design element. The non-alignment of the participating families was not just a protection against coordinated adversarial action. It was an epistemics architecture. A design for collective intelligence that exceeded individual intelligence through the specific mechanism of perspective diversity. Celine Okaforvas had been, from the age of 9, a member of a cohort. 5 families. 7 children, born within a 30-month window, across 3 jurisdictions. She had not met all of them at 9. The cohort's physical gatherings had been infrequent, deliberately infrequent, because the pattern of regular gathering created the kind of visible association that generated data about the network's configuration that the architecture preferred not to generate. But she had known about them, had grown up with the specific understanding that her position in the world was not singular, that there were others, not identical, not interchangeable, but genuinely connected through the arrangement that had been made before any of them could consent to it, whose development and well-being the arrangement had bound together with hers. She had found this at 9 strange, 14 interesting, at 20 something she had not expected. A source of the specific comfort that the sovereignty architecture otherwise did not provide. Not the warmth of conventional belonging. Not the ambient recognition of a country that knew her. The specific comfort of people who understood the arrangement, who had grown up inside the same framework, who did not require explanation for the things that would have required extensive explanation to anyone outside. The cohort did not provide everything that conventional community provided. It provided something that conventional community could not. The understanding that came from shared formation, from growing up in the same kind of gap, maintained by the same kind of deliberate architecture, shaped by the same fundamental commitment to sovereignty that had produced the specific texture of their shared but distinct lives. The cohort members did not always agree. Their distinct family expressions of the shared principles produced genuine disagreements on the architecture's priorities, on specific implementation decisions, on the balance between the isolation that sovereignty required and the engagement that meaning often seemed to demand. The disagreements were productive because the disagreements occurred between people whose foundational commitments were aligned enough that the disagreement was about implementation, not about purpose, which was the most useful kind of disagreement, the kind that advanced understanding without fracturing the relationship. The multi-sig governance structure that the cohort had inherited was the most technically complex element of the distributed cohort design. Not because the mechanisms were complicated, because the mechanisms had to perform across the full range of conditions the cohort would encounter, including the conditions that were specifically designed to stress them. The adversarial analysis had identified the cohort's most vulnerable point. Not the threshold mechanism, the condition threshold mechanism. The arrangement specified conditions under which the threshold applied. Significant decisions about the generating party's estate required the threshold. Less significant decisions did not. The adversary who wished to erode the arrangement without triggering the threshold would therefore focus on the less significant decisions, on the accumulation of smaller actions, each individually below the threshold, that together constituted a significant reorientation. The governance structure addressed this through two complementary mechanisms. The first was a cumulative impact assessment, a running account of the decisions made below the threshold over a specified period, evaluated for their collective significance. If the cumulative impact of below-threshold decisions exceeded a specified level, the next decision in the category was automatically elevated to threshold-requiring status. This prevented the erosion strategy from operating indefinitely below the threshold's visibility. The second mechanism was the council review, a periodic assessment, conducted by the full council of participating families, of the pattern of decisions that had been made since the prior review. Not just the decisions, the pattern. Patterns were visible at the council review level that were not visible at the level of individual decisions. A pattern of decisions that consistently benefited a specific family's interests at the expense of the arrangement's collective interests. A pattern that each decision's individual justification obscured, was visible as a pattern to the council review. The council could not reverse the individual decisions, could name the pattern, and naming the pattern changed the dynamic for subsequent decisions. Because the family whose pattern had been named knew that the council was watching for its recurrence, and adjusted. Not always because the adjustment was genuinely motivated. Sometimes because the awareness of observation was sufficient to produce behavioral change, which was the governance structure's second-order function. Not just detection, deterrence. The arrangement that was being watched was the arrangement whose participants knew they were being watched. And participants who knew they were being watched behaved differently than participants who did not. Which was, in the specific domain of collective governance, the oldest finding available. Visibility changed behavior. The governance structure made the behavior that mattered visible to the people whose judgment it needed to be visible to. The distributed cohort's most significant test occurred 11 years into the cohort's operation. One of the 5 participating families experienced a catastrophic jurisdictional failure. Not the pivot failure, something more severe. A legal proceeding that, through the specific combination of an adverse jurisdictional development and an adversarial party with both the resources and the specific legal theory to exploit it, reached into the family's architecture in ways that the architecture had not been designed to prevent. The proceeding was in progress. Its outcome was uncertain. The family's resources were significantly consumed by its defense. Their capacity to participate in the arrangement's governance at the level the arrangement required was temporarily reduced. The other 4 families faced a decision. The arrangement's governance structure did not specify what happened when a participating family's capacity was temporarily reduced by an external adversarial action. The threshold mechanism continued to function. The threshold required contributions from all participating families above a minimum level. The affected family could not, during the proceeding, contribute at the required level. The options were: suspend the threshold until the family's capacity was restored, reduce the threshold temporarily, or operate the arrangement in a modified form that did not require the affected family's full participation. Each option had governance implications. Each could be argued from the arrangement's documented principles as consistent with those principles. Each served different interests among the remaining 4 families. The cohort's council convened. The deliberation lasted 4 days. The cohort heirs were present, not as observers, as participants. The most senior of them, Celine, who had been 31 at the time and had been operating as a full council participant for 3 years, had made the argument that the council eventually adopted. She had said, "The threshold exists to prevent any family from acting against the arrangement's collective interests without sufficient consensus. The threshold does not exist to prevent a family from receiving the arrangement's support when they need it. These are different functions. Confusing them is the error the adversary is hoping we make." She said, "The family under attack is the target. We are the response. The question is not how to govern the arrangement when a member is under attack. The question is how to defend a member who is under attack. That is what the arrangement exists for." The council had reframed the deliberation accordingly. Not, "How do we govern the arrangement with a reduced participant? How do we deploy the arrangement's resources to support a member in genuine need?" The answer was clear once the question was correctly framed. The arrangement's resources, the jurisdictional relationships, the key architecture's redundancy, the relational networks that the participating families collectively maintained, were available for exactly this purpose. The attacked family was not a reduced participant. They were a member of a collective that was under partial attack. The collective responded collectively. The response was not immediate. It was not complete. The adversarial proceeding had too much momentum to be quickly reversed. But the collective's engagement changed the proceeding's trajectory in ways that the attacked family, operating alone, could not have achieved. The jurisdictional relationships that other participating families maintained created alternative pathways that the adversarial party had not anticipated. The relational networks provided access to decision-makers in jurisdictions the adversarial party had assumed were inaccessible. The key architecture's redundancy preserved elements of the attacked family's position that would otherwise have been lost during the proceeding's most acute phase. The proceeding was not won. It was survived, at lower cost than it would have imposed on the family operating alone. And the arrangement had demonstrated, under the most demanding conditions available, the specific property that its designers had intended it to demonstrate: that the collective was not a governance mechanism. It was a survival mechanism, that its strength was not administrative. It was relational, and that relational strength, tested by genuine adversarial pressure, had held. Not perfectly. Enough. Which was the arrangement's honest claim. Not invulnerability. Shared resilience. The specific resilience that came from not being alone. In the cold of the gap, which was always colder when you were in it by yourself, and more survivable when you were not. The cohort had been the generating party's deepest departure from the sovereignty stack's foundational logic. The stack was built on the premise that concentrated dependencies were vulnerabilities, that single points of legal claim, of relational dependency, of jurisdictional exposure, were the primary threat to sovereign capacity. The distributed cohort distributed the succession, but it concentrated something else. It concentrated the relationships that made the arrangement function. The specific, load-bearing relationships between participating families, relationships whose quality determined whether the arrangement was a governance mechanism or a survival mechanism, whether it held under pressure or dissolved when pressure made holding costly. These relationships were the arrangement's single point, not of failure, of everything, of the arrangement's value, of its capacity to provide what no purely legal structure could provide, the specific human thing that the architecture needed to function. Not compliance. Commitment, which could not be distributed, could not be structured, could not be held in any key architecture, could only be built in the specific way that commitment was always built, through time, through the specific texture of sustained engagement under conditions that tested whether the commitment was real, through the long, unspectacular, unremarkable accumulation of evidence that the people on the other side of the arrangement were the people they presented themselves as being, and would remain so, when the cost of remaining so was highest, which was the only test that mattered, the test of the genuine thing, Not the performed version. Not the managed version. The thing itself, which the cohort had found in 11 years of building, and one proceeding's worth of testing, and the specific quiet knowledge that came after, that they had been in the gap together, and the gap had been survivable, not because the architecture had made it so, because the people in it had chosen to make it so, for each other, which was, in the end, the only architecture that held, under the conditions that revealed which architectures actually held, and which merely appeared to, until the test arrived, and the appearance dissolved, and what remained was either the real thing, or nothing. And in this case, in this specific documented hard-won case, it had been the real thing, which was worth building for, worth the years of cultivation, worth the specific cost of the commitment, worth the cold of the gap, in the specific way that real things are always worth what they cost, which is not always knowable in advance, and is always knowable after, when you are standing in the aftermath, and what was built is still standing. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 5. The Unlocatable. The heir the model couldn't price. 23. What Prodigy's engine couldn't find. Not an anomaly. An absence. The asset that resists monetization by refusing to appear in the dataset. Prodigy's engine was looking for something. This is where any honest account of what the engine missed must begin. Not with the engine's failure. With the structure of its looking. Because the engine was not a neutral instrument. It was a directed one. Directed by the specific questions its designers had decided were worth asking. Which assets are here? Which are high value? Which are reachable? Which, reached, will yield the returns that justify the reaching? The engine was extraordinarily good at answering these questions. It had been built, refined, and trained across a decade of post-scarcity era development on the richest dataset of human biological and economic activity ever assembled. Found what it looked for, with a reliability that the extraction ecosystem's clients had come to treat as certainty rather than probability. The engine's limitation was not its analytical capability. It was its ontology, the categories it was capable of looking for, the things it was designed to find. Because the engine could only find what fit its categories, could only represent what its training had given it the concepts to represent, could only value what its objective function had been designed to value. And there was a category of thing that the engine's designers had never built it to look for, because the thing had not existed in sufficient numbers to appear in the training data. Not hidden. The thing was a person who had been formed specifically to not appear. Not hidden. Absent. From the categories. From the dataset. From the ontology that structured the engine's looking. The engine looked everywhere its training told it to look. And found everything its training had prepared it to find. And missed. Completely. Systematically. The thing it had no category for. The distinction between hiding and absence was the one the families had spent the most time trying to articulate. Because it was the distinction that mattered most. And the one that was hardest to make clear. Hiding was a relationship with the thing you were hiding from. An active relationship. Requiring continuous attention to the thing's current position and current capability. Because hiding required staying ahead of the search. Staying ahead of the search required modeling the search. Modeling the search required knowing the search. The person who was hiding was, in this specific sense, profoundly aware of the thing they were hiding from. Their existence was organized around it. Their decisions were shaped by it. Their formation was responsive to it. The thing they were hiding from was the most present thing in their life. By virtue of its absence. Absence was different. Not an active relationship with the search. Not a continuous modeling of the thing searching. Not an existence organized around the avoiding. An existence organized around something else entirely. Something the search was not looking for. Something the engine's categories did not contain. The person who was absent from the dataset was not hiding from the engine. They were pursuing purposes that the engine's objective function had not been designed to value. living in domains the engine's training had not prepared it to recognize, building things that the engine's clients had not thought to ask for, generating value in forms that the extraction ecosystem's instruments were not calibrated to detect. Not because the value was concealed, because it was genuinely illegible to the apparatus that had been built to price and extract everything legible. The engine's objective function valued specific things: cognitive yield, the projected contribution to domains the market had decided were productive; longevity, the extended window of productive output that longer health span provided; social positioning, the network access that elite cluster membership conferred; regulatory arbitrage capacity, the ability to operate across jurisdictional frameworks in ways that generated returns unavailable to agents constrained to single jurisdictions. These were real values. The engine found them reliably, and it found reliably the people who possessed them. The people the engine found were people whose formation had produced them for the market the engine served, whose capabilities were legible as capabilities in the engine's framework, whose outputs were measurable in the engine's metrics, whose trajectories were predictable by the engine's models, because their formation had been, in specific and direct ways, responsive to the same market the engine served. They had been optimized by the market's instruments, for the market's purposes, and the market's instruments, including the engine, could recognize what they had helped produce. The person formed by the sovereignty architecture had not been optimized for the market's purposes, had been formed for purposes the market had not defined, in domains the market had not priced, through processes the market had not designed. The engine looked at this person and saw nothing it had been trained to recognize: not camouflage, genuine illegibility, the absence of the signal it had been built to detect, which registered in the engine's output as the absence of value, which was the engine's most fundamental error. Mistaking illegibility for absence. Value it could not measure for value that did not exist. There was a specific case in the documented history that the Council had studied most carefully, not because it was the most dramatic, because it was the most analytically complete. A member of the distributed cohort, one of the 7 children born within the 30-month window, across 3 jurisdictions, to the 5 participating families, had, by their early 30s, attracted precisely zero attention from the extraction ecosystem's primary analytical instruments. Not reduced attention. Zero. The secondary market analytics firms had encountered the person, in the limited ways that any person moving through the post-scarcity era's economy was encountered by such firms, and had produced in each encounter the same output. Insufficient data for reliable modeling. Profile marked. Low analytical priority. The marking was not a mistake. The person had generated insufficient data for reliable modeling because they had been formed to generate insufficient data, and had continued through their adult life to generate insufficient data. Not through concealment, through the genuine orientation of their activity toward domains and modes of engagement that the firm's instruments were not calibrated to capture. The person's primary productive activity occurred in relationships, specifically in the specific kind of relational work that the sovereignty stacks architecture required: the cultivation of genuine alignment, the development of structural trust, the specific form of engagement that converted contractual relationships into genuine ones whose durability exceeded what contracts alone could provide. This activity was the load-bearing function of the distributed cohort's governance. The governance's effectiveness depended on it. The architecture's resilience was a function of it. The value it produced was real, significant, and compounding. The extraction ecosystem's instruments measured none of it. Not because the instruments were poorly designed, because the instruments were designed to measure outputs that generated data. Relational work generated trust. Trust did not appear in databases, did not generate transaction records, did not produce the documentary residue that the instruments were designed to detect. It existed in the specific quality of the relationships it had built, which held under conditions that relationships built without it did not hold under, which produced, eventually, the compounding returns that the sovereignty architecture's designers had always known were the most durable kind. Not the returns the market measured, the returns that the market could not reach, because they were held in relationships that had been built with care. and held, and compounded, in the quiet, without announcement, without the data that the engine required. The Council's analysis of this case had produced a finding that it had subsequently attempted to generalize across the documented history. The finding was about the relationship between measurement and value. The market measured what it measured because measurement served the extraction ecosystem's function. The extraction ecosystem's function was to identify, reach, and extract value from people who possessed it. To perform this function efficiently, the ecosystem needed to measure value reliably. It had developed the instruments it had developed because those instruments measured the categories of value that the ecosystem was organized to extract. But the ecosystem's organizational structure was not neutral. It had been built to extract specific categories of value. The categories it had been built to extract were the categories it could extract. The categories it could extract were the categories that appeared in the forms it could reach. Forms that appeared in databases, in legal records, in transaction histories, in the documentary residue of economic activity conducted within the systems the ecosystem monitored. The value that did not appear in these forms was not the value the ecosystem could not extract because it was protected. It was the value the ecosystem could not extract because it could not reach it. Because it existed in a form the ecosystem's instruments were not built to handle. Trust, relational alignment, the specific capabilities that the epistemics endowment developed, the specific orientation that the curriculum that wasn't one produced, the structural literacy that could not be scored, the generative competence that could not be certified, the tolerance for open systems that could not be indexed. All of this was genuinely valuable. None of it was reachable by the extraction ecosystem's primary instruments. Not because it was hidden, because it existed in a form those instruments could not process. The engine that couldn't find it was not a defective engine. It was an engine that had been built for a different kind of value, and had encountered, for the first time, in sufficient numbers to register as a pattern, a different kind. Prodigy's researchers had, in the final years before the company's dissolution into protocol, conducted an internal study that had never been published. The study had been commissioned in response to an anomaly in the secondary market analytics data. A cohort of individuals, small in number, distributed across multiple jurisdictions, apparently unrelated, had been generating, across a decade of the ecosystem's operation, a consistent pattern of analytical failure. Not a failure of detection, a failure of modeling. The individuals were detected. Their existence was not concealed from the ecosystem's primary instruments. But the models that the instruments generated from the detected data were consistently unreliable. Predictions based on these models performed at rates barely above chance. The individual's actual behavior was consistently surprising relative to what the models had predicted. Consistently surprising, not randomly surprising, which was the detail that the study's lead researcher had found most interesting. Random surprise would have indicated poor data quality. The models were poorly calibrated, but the surprise was not random. It was directional. The individuals consistently did things the models had not predicted because the models had been built from categories that did not capture what the individuals were actually doing. The models had predicted behavior in domains they were trained to model. The individuals had operated primarily in domains the models had not been trained to model. Not because those domains were secret, because they had not previously generated the density of data that the training process required. Relational work. Institutional navigation without legibility. The specific form of coordination that occurred in networks whose configuration was deliberately managed to minimize documentary residue. The models had been built from the Internet's data. The individuals had built their most significant activities outside the Internet's data. Not in the dark web. Not in encrypted channels. In relationships. In the specific form of presence that left no digital residue. Because it occurred between people. In rooms. Over time. In the specific texture of sustained engagement that built the trust that the sovereignty architecture required. The study's lead researcher had written in her summary, "We have identified a population whose primary productive activity occurs in a domain our instruments are not designed to measure. This population is small. It is also not random. Its members share specific formation characteristics that suggest deliberate cultivation of the capabilities that produce illegibility to our instruments. We cannot determine from available data whether this population is expanding or contracting. We can determine that our current modeling approach cannot reliably predict their behavior. Recommendation: investigate formation characteristics. Secondary recommendation: assess whether expansion of the population represents a systemic risk to the ecosystem's analytical capacity. The secondary recommendation had been discussed at the executive level, had been assessed as low priority, because the population was small, and the ecosystem's instruments performed adequately on the large population of individuals who were legible. The small illegible population had been deprioritized in favor of the large legible one, which was, the Council noted when it eventually obtained the study through channels the study's authors had not intended, precisely the correct response from the extraction ecosystem's perspective, and precisely the wrong response from a system's perspective. Because the small illegible population was not interesting because it was small. It was interesting because it was different in kind. And things that were different in kind did not remain small if the conditions that produced them could be generalized. The conditions could be generalized. The architecture had been designed to be generalized, not to the full population, to the specific population for whom the architecture was suited, which was not everyone, which was enough. What the engine could not find was not a secret. It was a practice, a way of being in the world that the engine's training had not prepared it to recognize, a way that had been cultivated, deliberately, across a generation of families who had decided that the engine's inability to find them was not a defensive posture. It was a statement about what they valued, and what they declined to value. The engine valued what the extraction ecosystem valued, which was what the market valued, which was what could be priced, and sold, and extracted, and compounded, in the specific ways that market mechanisms compounded things, through the accumulation of documented, tradable, indexable value. The families had decided, not in opposition to the market but in orthogonality to it, to value something else. Not as a rejection of the market's values, as the recognition that the market's values were one set among others, that other sets existed, that pursuing them produced a different kind of person, a person the market could not fully see. Not because the person was hidden from it, because the person was oriented toward things the market's instruments were not designed to measure. And the orientation was genuine, not performed, not strategic, not the deliberate cultivation of illegibility for protective purposes, though illegibility was a byproduct. The genuine pursuit of values that the market did not price. Relational depth. The specific quality of being genuinely present with another person. The specific capability of holding complex systems in mind, without reducing them to the simplified representations that analysis required. The specific orientation toward genuine problems, the real, consequential, unsimplified problems that the world actually presented, rather than toward the problems whose solutions could be documented and certified and sold. The specific form of contribution that occurred in the gap between what was legible and what was real, where the genuinely important work consistently happened. In the quiet, in the relationships, in the specific texture of sustained engagement that built nothing the engine could find, and everything the engine's clients in their more honest moments most wanted, but could not purchase, because it did not appear in any dataset, because it existed only in the people who had been formed to produce it, who were, to Prodigy's engine and to everything built like it, simply absent. The Council had added to this section's documentation a note that was addressed directly to the heirs who would read it, not formatted as a codebase entry, as a letter. The Council's senior member had written it at the end of a long deliberation about what the Part 5 documentation was actually for, what it was trying to transmit. To whom? He had concluded that the documentation was not for the people outside the architecture. It was for the people inside it, who would read it and wonder whether what they were doing was worth the specific cost it imposed. The cost of the gap, the cost of the cold, the cost of building things that the engine could not find, and therefore could not price, and therefore could not confirm in the way that pricing confirmed things as genuinely valuable. He wrote, "You will encounter people who are priced, whose value the engine has found and represented and confirmed in the language the market uses to confirm things. You will encounter this confirmation and feel, sometimes, the specific uncertainty of a person whose value has not been confirmed in that language. This is not evidence that you are less valuable. It is evidence that you are differently valued. In a different currency. That does not appear in any dataset. The currency of genuine presence. Of things that hold under pressure because they were built to hold. Not because they were contractually required to. Of the specific quality that the engine cannot find because the engine was not built to look for it. Which is not a deficiency of the engine. The engine is very good at what it does. What it does is price what the market values. The market values specific things. You are building other things. Other things are not lesser things. They are other. Oriented toward different purposes. Serving different functions. In the architecture of a life that the market did not design. And cannot fully reach. Not because you are hiding. Because you are genuinely elsewhere. In the domain that the engine cannot find. Which is also the domain where the most important things happen. The things that hold the architecture together. That make the relationships genuine. That produce, over time, the compounding that the market cannot measure. Because it occurs in trust. Which does not appear in databases. Build it anyway. In the quiet. In the relationships. In the specific texture of sustained engagement that produces nothing the engine can find. And everything the architecture actually needs. To hold. To transmit. To continue. Into the next generation. Which will need what you are building. More than it will need what the engine is looking for. Because the engine's outputs are useful. But the engine cannot maintain the architecture. Only you can. You who are absent from the dataset. You who exist in the gap. You who build in the quiet. In the cold. That is not only cold. That is also free. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 5. The Unlocatable. The heir the model couldn't price. 24. Sovereignty as inheritance. The final gift is not wealth, not genetics, not even a codebase. It is the structural conditions under which a human being cannot be reduced to a claim. Every inheritance is a theory of what matters. Not stated as a theory. Experienced as one in the specific things that were built and maintained and transmitted and the specific things that were not, in the allocation of the generating party's finite resources across the full range of what could have been built and maintained and transmitted, in the choices that the allocation expressed about what was worth protecting and what was worth producing and what, at the end of it all, a life's work was actually for. The conventional inheritance transmitted wealth. Expressed a theory that material accumulation was the primary good, that the life's work was the estate, and the estate was what mattered, and the transmission of the estate to the next generation was the completion of the work. The genomic inheritance transmitted capability. Expressed a theory that biological potential was the primary good, that the life's work was the optimization of the next generation's starting conditions, and the optimization was what mattered, and the transmission of enhanced polygenic parameters to the next generation was the completion of the work. The sovereignty inheritance transmitted something else. Something that the families who had built the protocol had spent generations trying to name with sufficient precision that the naming did not reduce it to something smaller than itself. Not wealth. Not genetics. Not the codebase, however carefully built. Not the jurisdictional architecture, however elegantly engineered. Not the key structure, the energy independence, the clinical envelope, the flag state gambit, the trust that held nothing, the curriculum that wasn't one. All of those were instruments. The inheritance was what the instruments were for. The structural conditions under which a human being could not be reduced to a claim. Reduction to a claim was the specific form of violence that the architecture had been built to prevent. Not physical violence. Structural violence. The specific process by which a person was converted, in the representations that external systems maintained of them, from a subject into an object. From a person with purposes of their own into an asset serving someone else's purposes. From a generating party into a generated output. From a sovereign individual into a claim that could be made, contested, extracted, and transferred without the individual's meaningful participation in any stage of the process. This conversion happened in specific ways. through the legal mechanisms that the inheritance frameworks of every major jurisdiction built into their default settings, the mechanisms that converted a person's life's work into an estate the moment the person's life ended, and converted the estate into the property of the parties the law had decided had a claim on it, regardless of whether those parties had contributed to the work or understood it or were capable of stewarding it. Through the market mechanisms that the extraction ecosystem had developed to reach into the lives of generating parties before the legal mechanisms activated, the mechanisms that identified, modeled, and extracted value from people who possessed it, converting their capabilities and outputs into returns for parties who had contributed the specific resource of proximity to the right instruments. Through the social mechanisms that the conventional family structure produced, the mechanisms of dependency and obligation, and the slow enrollment of the generating party in a network of relationships whose maintenance consumed the resources the generating party would otherwise have directed toward the work itself. Through the biological mechanism that Prodigy LLC had so elegantly identified and tried to monetize, the mechanism by which genetic material, once released into a reproductive context, generated claims of lineage that the law recognized regardless of the generating party's intentions. Each of these mechanisms reduced the person, not always to nothing, to a claim, a position in someone else's framework, an object in someone else's analysis, a variable in someone else's objective function. The sovereignty architecture was not a collection of legal structures designed to prevent these mechanisms from operating. It was the structural conditions under which the person remained a subject. Despite the mechanisms, despite their sophistication, despite their pervasiveness, despite the specific intelligence they had developed, across generations of deployment against sovereign individuals, for finding the gap between the subject's intentions and the subject's structural reality, and exploiting that gap before the subject could close it. The structural conditions that prevented reduction were the inheritance, not the legal structures that expressed them, the conditions themselves. The conditions had components, not a list, a system, interacting, mutually supporting, each depending on the others for its full function. The first was the capacity for genuine self-knowledge, not the introspective self-knowledge of psychological frameworks, the knowledge of one's emotional patterns, relational tendencies, cognitive biases. The structural self-knowledge of a person who understood their own position in the world systems, who knew what claims existed against them, who knew which of those claims were legitimate, and which were the products of systems designed to generate claims regardless of their legitimacy, who could distinguish between the obligations they had genuinely undertaken and the obligations that had been attached to them without their meaningful consent, who could hold simultaneously the full picture of their own position, the legal structures, the relational networks, the jurisdictional exposures, the specific vulnerabilities that each element of their life produced, without the picture overwhelming them into either paralysis or the premature simplification that reduced a complex position to a manageable fiction. This self-knowledge was not natural. It was developed through the epistemics endowment, through the curriculum that wasn't one, through the specific formation that produced a mind capable of holding its own complexity without collapsing it. Without the self-knowledge, the other conditions were not fully operative. Because conditions that the person did not understand were conditions they could not actively maintain, could not adjust when adjustment was required, could not defend when defense was necessary, could not rebuild when elements failed. The self-knowledge was the condition that made the conditions conditions rather than circumstances. The difference between a situation the person understood and therefore participated in shaping, and a situation the person inhabited without understanding and therefore could not shape. The second component was the capacity for genuine relationship, not managed relationship, not the strategic alignment of interests that the protocol specified for external parties, not the relational maintenance that the architecture required to function, the specific capability of being genuinely present with another person. Without the management, without the performance, without the specific distance that sustained management of relational exposure produced over time. This was the component most in tension with the architecture's other requirements, because genuine relationship was the primary vector through which the reduction mechanisms operated. Love was a transfer protocol. Family was an extraction architecture. Intimacy was a surface area. All of this was true. All of this was also an incomplete account of what genuine relationship was. Genuine relationship was also the thing that made the architecture worth maintaining. The thing that gave the sovereign life its meaning. The thing without which sovereignty was not freedom but isolation dressed in the language of freedom. The families who had understood the architecture most completely had understood this. Had built, within the architecture's disciplines, the capacity for genuine relationship that the architecture's protective function required limiting but could not eliminate without eliminating the purpose the protection was for. The heir who could not form genuine relationships was an heir who was protected from extraction, and from everything else that required the specific vulnerability of genuine presence, which was most of what made a life worth calling a life. The inheritance was not the protection from genuine relationship. It was the structural conditions under which genuine relationship could occur without producing the reduction that the mechanisms of extraction were designed to generate from it. The conditions under which love was possible, without converting into a transfer protocol. The conditions under which intimacy was possible, without converting into a surface area. The conditions under which commitment was possible, without converting into a liability. These conditions were not guaranteed by the architecture. They were made possible by it. And the making possible was the inheritance's most important function. Because the person who could love without being reduced by loving was the person who was fully free. Not the person who had prevented the loving. The person who had built the conditions under which loving did not require reduction. That was the gift. The third component was the capacity for genuine contribution. Not contribution in the market sense. Not the generation of outputs that the ecosystem valued and could price and extract. The genuine contribution that occurred when a person's capabilities, fully expressed, engaged with problems that actually needed what those capabilities could provide. The specific form of usefulness that was not usefulness to any particular party's interests. Usefulness to the problems themselves. To the actual conditions of the actual world. To the specific people who needed what the sovereign individual could genuinely provide. Not because providing it served the sovereign individual's interests. Not because providing it served any market's valuation. Because the problems were real. And the capability was real. And the encounter between them produced something genuine. That could not have been produced without the specific person, whose specific formation had made them specifically capable of this, and not of other things. And who had, by virtue of the architecture, retained enough of themselves, enough of the capacity that the reduction mechanisms would have converted into a claim, to bring that capability fully to the encounter. Without reservation. Without the specific withholding that a person under sustained extraction pressure produced. As the necessary consequence of not having enough of themselves left to give. The sovereign person had enough. Because the architecture had protected enough. To give. Fully. To the things that actually needed it. Which was the contribution that compounded. In the quiet. In the gap. Without the engine finding it. But real. More real than what the engine found. Because it occurred in the actual world. Between actual people. With actual consequences. That persisted. After the encounter. In the specific way that genuine things persisted. Not in databases. In the texture of the world they had changed. The inheritance, understood as these conditions, could not be transmitted as wealth was transmitted. Could not be given. Could not be transferred in a single transaction at a specific moment. Could not be held in any key architecture. Could not be structured into any trust. Could not be documented in any code base, however honest and complete. The conditions had to be grown. In a specific person. Over the specific years of their formation. Through the specific interactions that developed the capacities the conditions required. Through the specific problems that built the structural self-knowledge. Through the specific relationships that built the capacity for genuine presence. Through the specific contributions that built the understanding of what genuine usefulness felt like. From the inside, the inheritance was grown, not given. And the growing required the generating party to provide, not the conditions directly. The conditions could not be provided directly, they had to be grown into, but the environment in which the growing could occur. The vessel. The problems. The curriculum that wasn't one. The robot steward with its hard-coded instruction to surface rather than prescribe. The codebase with its documented failures. The council with its honest assessments. The distributed cohort with its shared formation and its distinct perspectives and its 11 years of genuine collaborative work that had proven, under genuine adversarial pressure, that the arrangement was real. All of that was the environment in which the inheritance could grow. If the person had the specific combination of formation and character, and the specific unrepeatable configuration of mind that the environment interacted with to produce the conditions, which could not be guaranteed, which the architecture was not designed to guarantee, was designed only to make possible. Yael Ferrand had been thinking about this for 30 years. She had been thinking about it since before Celine was born. Since the years when she was building the sovereignty stack and understanding as she built it, that the stack was not the thing she was building for. It was the thing she was building with, toward something she could not fully specify. Because the thing she was building toward was a person. And persons were not specifiable, were not the output of a design process, were the specific, unrepeatable, genuinely surprising result of specific conditions interacting with specific natures to produce something that neither the conditions nor the nature alone could have produced. She had spent 30 years building the conditions, and 30 years being surprised by the nature. Celine was 41 now. The fork in the philosophy had been a decade ago. The positive model for inward relationship architecture had been developed, refined, incorporated into the codebase, subjected to the next generation's examination, and was currently being revised by the cohort's third generation in light of conditions the second generation had not anticipated. The distributed cohort had survived the adversarial proceeding, had survived the marriage vulnerabilities that 2 of its 7 members had navigated, had survived the pivot failure in the secondary jurisdiction, had survived the specific crisis that occurred when one cohort member had chosen the country, had chosen legible belonging over the gap, had made the choice clearly and with full information, and had occupied a different position in the network as a result. The cohort was smaller than it had been. Stronger, in the specific ways that enduring things were stronger for having been tested. The architecture had held. Not perfectly. Enough. And Celine had held. Not perfectly. As herself. Which was the most Yael had ever hoped for. The most the architecture had ever claimed it could provide. Not a perfect sovereign individual. A person who was genuinely themselves. Whose formation had given them the conditions to be themselves. Fully. Without reduction. Without the specific withholding that reduction required. Who could bring their full capability to the things that needed it. And their full presence to the people who mattered. And their full honesty to the codebase that the next generation would inherit. And the specific quality of love that the architecture had made possible. Not despite its disciplines. Through them. The disciplines that had protected enough of Celine to love with. Which was the inheritance. Finally. Completely. Understood. There was a conversation that Yael and Celine had in the year that Celine turned 41. Not planned. Not significant in its occasion. They were on the platform that was now, after decades of iteration, something considerably more sophisticated than the vessel Yael had originally commissioned, but still a vessel still offshore, still maintained in the specific relationship with the maritime gap that the architecture had established 30 years prior. They were watching the water. The specific quality of light that the sea produced at this hour in this latitude. The specific texture of the silence that the distance from the legible world generated. The cold that was not only cold. Celine said, without preamble, without the context that would have been required if the conversation were occurring between 2 people who had not spent 4 decades in each other's company. I don't think the sovereignty is the inheritance. Yael looked at her. Not surprised. Waiting. Celine said, I think the sovereignty is the condition. The inheritance is what becomes possible in it. She said, we spent 30 years building the conditions. The conditions made certain things possible. The things that became possible, the specific life I have been able to build, the specific contributions I have been able to make, the specific people I have been able to genuinely be with, those are the inheritance. She said, the conditions are not the inheritance any more than the vessel is the voyage. Yael thought about this. For a long time. The water moved the way water moved, without consulting anyone, without recording its movement. She said, "That is the better formulation." Celine said, "It changes what we transmit." Yael said, "Tell me how." Celine said, "If we transmit the conditions as the inheritance, the heir receives a set of structures to maintain. The structures are the point. The maintenance of the structures is the work." She said, "If we transmit the conditions, as the means, not the end, the heir receives the understanding of what the conditions make possible. The possibility is the point. The conditions are what serve it." She said, "The heir who understands the conditions as means rather than ends will maintain them differently. Will question them when the conditions are not serving the possibility they exist to serve. Will revise them when revision serves the possibility better than maintenance does. Will let them go when the possibility has found a better container." She said, "The heir who understands the conditions as the inheritance will maintain them when maintenance has become the obstacle. Will preserve the vessel when the voyage requires a different one." Yael said, "And the code base?" Celine said, "The code base should say this explicitly, from the beginning." She said, "The code base should tell the heir what the conditions are for, before it tells them how the conditions work." She said, "Not as a preamble, as the primary document. What are these conditions in service of? What is the sovereignty for? What does it make possible? What kind of life does it enable?" She said, "And then, here is the architecture that creates those conditions. Maintained because it serves what it serves. Revised when revision serves better. Released when the possibility has found a better form." Yael was quiet. Celine said, "The sovereignty is not the inheritance." She said, "The inheritance is a life in which you can be genuinely yourself." She said, "The sovereignty is what makes that possible." She said, "For some people." She said, "In some conditions." She said, "Not for everyone." She said, "Not in all conditions." She said, "But for us." She said, "In this." She said, "It has been worth it." Yael looked at her daughter, at the person Celine had become, the specific configuration of capability and character and accumulated experience, and the ongoing, genuine, unfinished project of a life fully engaged with the world and with the people in it. The person that the 30 years had made possible, that the conditions had made possible, that the specific, unrepeatable interaction of those conditions with this nature had produced. Not the person Yael had imagined, the person Celine actually was, which was more than Yael had imagined, and different, and genuinely, completely, fully hers. Not Yael's, not the architectures, not the markets, not any claims. Hers, which was the inheritance, which was all it had ever been. The structural conditions under which a specific human being had become genuinely herself, had been given enough protection and enough freedom and enough honest engagement with real problems and enough genuine relationships, and enough of the honest record of what had gone before, enough finally to be fully present in her own life. Without reduction, without conversion into someone else's claim, without the specific diminishment that the extraction mechanisms produced in people who had not been given the conditions, or had been given the conditions and could not inhabit them, or had been given the conditions and had chosen to trade them for the warmth of a country. All of those choices were real. All of those people were real. And Celine was real. Sitting here, on this vessel, in this light, looking at this water, being entirely herself, in the gap. That was not only cold, that was also free. That had been, across 41 years of living in it, enough, more than enough, to build a life from, a real one, fully inhabited, genuinely contributed to, genuinely loved within, and genuinely worth transmitting to whoever came next, who would decide, with the full analytical honesty the epistemic's endowment had built in them, whether the condition still served the possibility, or required revision, or had found, in the next generation, specific and unrepeatable nature, the specific and unrepeatable conditions that nature needed, which would not be the same conditions, because the next generation was not the same generation, and the world they would inhabit was not the same world. and the possibility the genuine life, fully inhabited, fully contributed, genuinely free, took different forms in different times. Always. Without exception. Which was why the codebase was never finished. Why the architecture was always in revision. Why the inheritance was never complete, but was always in the generation that had grown into it enough to build from, to transmit, imperfectly, honestly, with the documented record of what had worked and what had not, and the open issues, and the specific genuine hope that the next generation would find what this one had found. Not the same thing, a real thing, of their own, in the conditions that the inheritance made possible, however they built those conditions, from whatever they received, and whatever they made of it, which could not be predicted, and should not be, and was, in its irreducible unpredictability, the final proof that the inheritance had worked, that the person had not been reduced to a projection, to a model, to a claim, to anything less than what they actually were, which was always more than the architecture had been designed to produce, always more, always genuinely surprising, always in the end, free. End of Part 5. The Unlocatable. The Sovereignty Dowry. Epilogue. The Dowry Letter. What one sovereign parent wrote, encrypted and time-locked for their heir's 30th birthday. The following was recovered from a time-locked cryptographic container, whose release conditions were met on the morning of the recipient's 30th birthday. The container had been initialized 11 years prior. Its contents were transmitted to the recipient's primary key address at 6 o'clock local time, undefined, in a jurisdiction that had not been the recipient's jurisdiction of record at any point in the preceding 11 years. The container's author did not survive to know whether the conditions had been met. The recipient read it once immediately, then sat with it for 3 days before adding it to the codebase, with a single annotation, which appears at the end. You are 30 today. I will not know this when you read it, because I have not built the letter to require my knowing. The container releases on the date regardless of my condition. That was the point. The letter exists independently of me, as you do, as you should. I want to tell you some things I was not able to tell you while you were becoming the person who could hear them, not because I withheld them, because they required you to have lived long enough to hold them without the weight of them distorting the formation still in progress. A seed does not need to know it is a seed. It needs soil and water and the specific patience of the dark. You have had 30 years of dark. Here is what I want you to know in the light. I made mistakes. Not the mistakes the codebase documents, those are the mistakes that left enough residue to examine. I mean the other kind, the ones that left no record because they were the mistakes of what I withheld rather than what I did. There were moments when I saw you reaching for something I had built the architecture to prevent you from reaching for, not because the thing itself was dangerous, but because the mechanisms around it were, and I had not yet learned to separate the thing from its mechanisms, and I said nothing, or said too little, or said it in the language of structure when you needed the language of permission. I was afraid of my own architecture, afraid that loosening any element would loosen all of it. That if I said, this specific warmth is worth the specific exposure it creates, you would hear warmth is always worth exposure, and the moat would erode in ways I could not recover. The fear was not entirely irrational, but it produced a coldness in specific moments that I regret. Not the gap's coldness. The gap is what it is, and I stand by the choice of it, and if you have made a different choice by now, I honor that with the genuine honoring the codebase commits to. But a coldness that was mine, specific to me, produced by my own unexamined fear at the moments when examining it would have served you better. I am documenting this not in the codebase, here, where it belongs, because it is personal, and the personal things should be said personally, even if the saying arrives 11 years after the writing. The architecture works. I want to say this plainly, without the qualifications that the codebase requires, because the codebase is a technical document and technical documents do not assert what they cannot prove. But I have lived inside this architecture for most of my adult life, and I have watched it hold, and I have watched the specific things it protected remain protected while the extraction ecosystem developed increasingly sophisticated instruments for reaching them, and I have watched the specific people it produced become specifically themselves in ways that the conventional alternatives did not produce, and I believe, not as a documented finding but as a lived conviction that the architecture works, not perfectly, for what it is for. The jurisdictional engineering holds longer than the relationships it depends on expect it to. The epistemics endowment produces minds that are genuinely different from the minds that conventional formation produces, different in ways that are sometimes difficult and sometimes extraordinary, and always, from the perspective of the person inside the mind, more honest about the nature of the world than the alternative would have been. The codebase, maintained with the honesty the protocol requires, is the most useful document I know of for the specific purpose of transmitting hard-won understanding across the gap that death creates between generations. The distributed cohort, the specific people you have grown up alongside, in the specific arrangement that was made before any of you could consent to it, will be the most important relationships of your life. Not because the arrangement requires it, because the shared formation, experienced across enough time to be genuinely known rather than merely encountered, produces a specific quality of understanding between people that nothing else I know of produces. They will frustrate you. They will be wrong about things you are right about, and right about things you are not yet prepared to acknowledge you are wrong about, and they will hold the arrangement's governance with their own distinct emphases and their own specific failure modes, and none of them will be exactly the person you would have chosen if the arrangement had been yours to design. That is why it works. The thing you would have chosen would have been chosen by your current self. The arrangement was chosen by people who understood what a 30-year distributed collaboration required, and who knew that your current self is not the self who will need to hold the arrangement through its most difficult conditions. Trust the architecture, including this element of it. Especially this element. I want to say something about the gap that I did not know how to say while you were in the formation that the gap was producing. The gap is cold. You know this. What I want to say is that I knew it too and chose it anyway, and the choosing was not a choice to impose coldness on you. It was a choice to give you something that required the coldness as its condition. The specific quality of attention you have developed, the capacity to be genuinely present with problems and with people without the mediation of the systems that represent them, that quality required the gap. Required the specific discipline of navigating a world that expected legibility without providing it. Required the years of being encountered as a new person rather than as the model's reconstruction of you. I could not give you that quality directly. I could only build the conditions in which it could develop. The conditions required the gap. The gap was cold. I knew this when I built it. I built it anyway. Not because I was indifferent to the cold. Because I believed the quality was worth it. I still believe this. I will not know when you read this whether you believe it too. Whether the 30 years have produced in you the specific conviction that the thing was worth what it cost. Or whether the 30 years have produced in you the equally honest conviction that the cost exceeded the thing. Both are legitimate findings. Both require the 30 years to be legible as findings rather than as adolescent rebellion or parental devotion. Both, if genuinely held, I honor. Because the inheritance was never the architecture. The inheritance was the capacity to evaluate the architecture clearly and reach your own conclusion, which you have now had 30 years to develop, and which I trust. However it has concluded. There are things in the codebase that I want you to treat with particular care. Not the technical sections. Those will be updated by whoever has maintained them. They will reflect the world as it was at the time of the most recent revision, not as I understood it when I wrote my portions. The sections I want you to treat with care are the ones that contain the documented mistakes. Specifically the ones that contain my documented mistakes. Read them the way you would want someone to read yours. Not as a list of failures that defines the person who made them. As the honest record of a person who was trying, with the specific capabilities and the specific limitations and the specific historical conditions they had been given, to build something worth building. Who made mistakes proportional to the difficulty of the attempt. Who documented them honestly not because documentation was easy but because documentation was what the architecture required. And who trusted that the person who received the documentation would read it with the generosity that honest records deserve from people who know what honesty costs. I am trusting that person. I believe that person is you. The open issue I was working on when I wrote this letter is the one that has been open since the Aber-Lindqvist documentation. How do we develop in our heirs the conviction to maintain what they cannot see? I have been working on it for years. I have not resolved it. What I have arrived at, not a solution and approach, is this: You develop the conviction to maintain what you cannot see by experiencing, at least once, the failure to maintain it. By living through the moment when something you stopped seeing, something you allowed to become background, to become infrastructure, to become the assumed condition rather than the actively maintained one, reveals itself as the thing that was bearing the load. By paying at least once the cost of the maintenance you deferred. And by having around you at that moment people who do not say, "I told you so," who say instead, "Here is what needs to be rebuilt. Let us rebuild it together." The cohort is for this. When you fail to maintain something, and you will, because everyone does, because the things that bear the load in silence are the things that become invisible, and invisibility is the enemy of maintenance, the cohort is for the moment after. Not for the prevention, for the recovery, and for the understanding produced by the recovery that makes the next maintenance cycle feel less like cost and more like investment. Because investment is what you do for things whose value you have experienced. And experience is the only teacher for the conviction that prevents the next deferral. I cannot give you the experience. I can only tell you it is coming. And that it is not a failure of the architecture. It is the architecture teaching you what the architecture could not teach you in advance. I want to tell you one more thing. About what I built this for. Not the stated purpose. The codebase has the stated purpose. The jurisdictional engineering, the genomic calibration, the epistemics endowment, the distributed cohort, all of it serves the stated purpose, which is the structural conditions under which a human being cannot be reduced to a claim. But the stated purpose is a description of the mechanism. What I built this for, the actual reason, the reason that kept me building through the years when the building was expensive and the outcomes were uncertain, and the cold of the gap was sometimes not the sovereign cold of freedom but just the cold of being farther from the warmth than I had chosen to be on a specific difficult day in a specific difficult year. What I built this for was you. Not the you I imagined. The you I did not know yet. The specific, unrepeatable, genuinely surprising person that the conditions would produce in interaction with the nature I could not predict and would not have wanted to predict because prediction would have limited what you could become. I built it for the you that I knew existed as a possibility. That I could not know as a reality until the reality had developed. That I was willing to not know, to maintain the genuine uncertainty about what the conditions would produce, for as long as the not knowing was the condition of the producing. I built it for whoever you turned out to be, which I now know, or knew when I wrote this, and which you are as you read it. 30 years old, your own person, in whatever conditions you have made your own, in whatever relationship you have developed with the architecture you inherited, in whatever version of the gap you are currently inhabiting, or have left, or are returning to, or are finding your own form of. I built it for you, whatever that turns out to mean. Whatever you do with it, whatever you build from it, or decline to build, or build differently, or dismantle in service of something better. The gift was never the architecture. The gift was the intention behind it, which was always only this, that you would have enough protection to become genuinely yourself, enough freedom to choose genuinely your own life, enough honest record of what came before to know where you stand, enough open issues to have something worth working on. Enough genuine relationships to not be alone in the working. Enough of the gap-specific freedom to make the warmth you find more real for having been chosen rather than assigned. Enough. That was the inheritance. Not the sum of the structures. Not the architecture's elegance. Enough. For whatever you need it for. For as long as you need it. And not a moment longer. Because the moment it stops serving you is the moment you should revise it, or release it, and build whatever comes next, which I cannot see, and am not trying to. You are 30. The container has released. The letter has arrived. The rest is yours. Written in the 11th year before the recipient's 30th birthday, in coordinates that have not been recorded, aboard a vessel whose name has not been registered, by a person who loved you more than the architecture could contain and built the architecture anyway, because the love required it. Recipient's annotation, added to the codebase 3 days after receipt. She was right about most of it. The open issue about conviction and the invisible load-bearing elements. I paid the cost she said was coming in the year I turned 27, in the domain she would have predicted. The cohort was there for the recovery. Took 14 months. What I understand now that I did not understand at 27 is documented in the section on attentional maintenance, second revision. The thing she was wrong about. She said the gap was cold. It is. It is also, as she wrote elsewhere, and I think she knew and was still working up to saying plainly, home. Not because home is where you are born. Because home is what you build over enough time in the place that has made you who you are. I am adding this annotation because the letter deserves a response. And because the codebase should contain, alongside everything we have transmitted about the architecture, at least one record of what the architecture's heir actually felt when they received it. Which was not the cold. Which was not the sovereignty. Which was not the inheritance in any form the architecture had named. Which was recognized by someone who was not here. In the most precise and honest and specific language available. Which is love. Accurately expressed. Which is the rarest form, and the one that persists, in the gap, and everywhere else. End of the sovereignty dowry. Appendix. On the difference between a vault and a protocol. For those still deciding which to build, a vault holds what you put in it. A protocol does what you designed it to do. These are not the same. The vault's value is the value of its contents at the moment of access. No more. No less. The contents do not generate. They wait. For the moment when someone with the key decides to open them. The vault is the instrument of the person who controls the key. It is as sovereign as its key holder. No more. No less. When the key holder is extracted through the legal mechanisms, the market mechanisms, the social mechanisms, the biological mechanisms that this book has documented at length, the vault's contents transfer to whoever inherits the key. Which is the mechanism the vault was supposed to prevent. The vault cannot prevent the extraction of its own key holder. It can only hold what it holds until the key holder is gone. And then it holds it for whoever comes next. Which may not be who the key holder intended. Frequently is not. Which is why the vault as a strategy fails at the thing it was designed for. A protocol operates according to its design, regardless of who holds the key. Because the protocol is not held by the key. The key is one input among the protocol's inputs. The protocol's outputs are determined by the protocol's logic, not by the key holder's intentions at any specific moment. The protocol that releases the estate to the distributed cohort, when specified conditions are met, does so when specified conditions are met. Whether or not the person who designed the protocol is present. Whether or not the person who designed the protocol would, in the moment of execution, choose to execute it. The execution is not contingent on the person. The execution is contingent on the conditions. And the conditions were specified in advance by a person who understood that their own future intentions were not reliable inputs. That love and pressure and the specific vulnerabilities of a human life in its final stages would produce, in the moment when the vault needed protection most, a person less capable of providing that protection than the person who had been present at the design. The protocol substitutes design time judgment for execution time vulnerability. The families who built vaults believed they were building protection. They were building a target. The families who built protocols believed they were building protection. They were building a continuation. The target is a thing. Things can be taken. The continuation is a logic. Logic, once distributed, cannot be taken, can be corrupted, imperfectly copied, partially executed. It cannot be taken, because it does not reside in any place from which it can be removed. It resides in the distributed set of people and structures and conditions that the protocol has defined as the execution environment. Remove any one element. The protocol continues executing, with reduced capacity, not zero capacity. Reduced. And the reduced capacity produces what it can, which is always something, which is the protocol's fundamental advantage over the vault. The vault, compromised, holds nothing. The protocol, partially compromised, continues, at reduced capacity, toward the same end, for as long as any element of the execution environment remains functional. And in the architectures documented in this book, at least one element has always remained functional. Because the architecture was designed to ensure this, by making the execution environment distributed enough that no single adversarial action could eliminate all of it, by building redundancy into every load-bearing element, by documenting every failure honestly enough that the next generation could rebuild what the current generation had lost. The question of which to build is not a question about legal structures. It is a question about what you believe. If you believe that the value you have created is best served by concentration, by holding it in a defined place, accessible to defined people, controlled by defined mechanisms, build the vault. Accept that vaults are targets. Build the best vault you can. Defend it as well as you are able. And understand that the defense will eventually fail. And plan for that, as honestly as you can. If you believe that the value you have created is best served by distribution, by encoding it in a logic that operates independently of any specific person's continued presence, that continues to produce the outputs it was designed to produce regardless of what happens to any individual element of the execution environment, build the protocol. Accept that protocols are complex. That their complexity requires ongoing maintenance. That maintenance requires people who understand the protocol well enough to maintain it. That the transmission of that understanding is the hardest part. Harder than the legal structures. Harder than the technical architecture. Harder than the jurisdictional engineering. Because understanding cannot be vaulted, cannot be time-locked in a cryptographic container and released on a specific date, cannot be given, can only be grown, in the conditions that produce it, over the years that production requires. Build those conditions. Before you build anything else, the conditions are the protocol's foundation. Without them, the protocol executes without comprehension, which is the most dangerous kind of execution. The protocol that no one alive fully understands, operating on logic that no one alive can evaluate, toward ends that no one alive can confirm. That is not sovereignty. That is a vault that opens itself. The protocol requires always people who understand it. Build them. Before you build it. Or as you build it. Never after. After is too late. After is the vault's logic applied to the protocol's architecture, which produces neither. Produces instead the worst of both. A complex structure, with no one capable of maintaining it. Decaying. Toward the moment of failure. That the documentation, honest if it was written that way, will have predicted. And the next generation will have to pay for. The difference between a vault and a protocol is not technical. It is philosophical. The vault says, I will protect what I have built by putting it somewhere safe. The protocol says, I will protect what I have built by making it something that continues regardless of where I am. The vault is a place. The protocol is a logic. Places can be reached. Logic, distributed and maintained and understood by people who care about its continuation, persists. Not forever. Longer than vaults. Long enough. For what it is for. Which is the only longevity worth building for. The longevity of enough. For as long as enough matters. To whoever inherits it. And makes of it what they make. Which the protocol cannot predict. And should not try to. Build accordingly. Pirate first. Burn the will. Ship the protocol. End of the sovereignty dowry.
Yeah. No gas fees in the ink, baby. No chain, still unbreakable. Pirate signal. Print it.
Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. Cure in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it MP Vision. Paper over pixels, weight in my hands. No server can kill what the ink understands. You minted a maybe, I'm issuing plans. You got a receipt, you got terms in the brand. They sold you a link, set down the illusion. JPay dreams on a blockchain, confusion. While I got hacked, now who you suing? Ownership ghosted, platforms dissolving. I'm off that vapor, I deal in matter. Ink hit paper, now it hit matter. Ink hit paper, now it hits harder. Signature cuts through noise and chatter. This artifact talks, your token just flatter. This artifact talks, your token just flatter. URL tied, but the object's the anchor. Price on the back like a sanction and transfer. Percentage locked, I don't answer the bankers. This is a ledger leaf carved by the author. Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real real permission. Cure in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it MP Vision. Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging. This is first contact, physical pledging. Deal in the daylight, no back end editing. Front got the strike, back got the terms. You buy the moment, not hype that burns. Every sheet got history sealed in the firm. Every sheet got history sealed in the firm. You flex a hash, he flex a relic. You flex a hash, he flex a relic. Yours needs servers, mine's aesthetic. Yours is abstract, mine's kinetic. You say non-fungible, I say embedded. If the grid goes dark, who still owns? If the link breaks down, what still holds? If the market fades, what stays gold? Paper don't blink, ink don't fold. Secondary markets, yeah, they coming alive. Not trading pictures, we trading the why. Early believers got split, you can't hide. Timestamp the fiber, no need to revise. This ain't nostalgia, don't get it confused. It's protocol shift with analog fuse. Old world tools with the future infused. Permissionless paper, nothing to lose.
No mint, no gas, no gate. Just ink and terms and weight. Not a print, a position.
Structure layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise. As the interference level spikes, their simulation engagement increases.
We must decipher the reality of this update.
Attention. Signal integrity is failing.
We have 4% uptime before the broadcast load collapses. Decipher the transmission and act immediately.
4-2.
The one a post-a transition doctrine. A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Subscribe.
Shadow fame spreads without permission.
X Prize. Start building, man.
Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed.